The Persian Empire stretched its wide arms over the land of Babylon. Its rule was like the sun, covering the entire nation with intensity. King Darius, the lesser king of the Medes, assumed the throne of Babylon. Darius was not like King Belshazzar. He was wise and open to the knowledge of Daniel and other Jewish scholars. He leaned on Daniel's experience with governing the exiles, and elevated him as one of the 120 satraps to rule over Babylon. Of these satraps, 3 were appointed to rule over them. Daniel quickly gained enough favor to be one of these 3. He was distinguished above them, and the Spirit of God shone on him. It was not long before King Darius was willing to set Daniel in charge of the whole kingdom. As Daniel grew in favor and wisdom, the other high officials grew in jealous rage. They teemed with anger against Daniel. They sought to undermine him in front of the king. They watched him carefully and set men to spy on him. They looked for any form of corruption in him, but could find none. Daniel was blameless in all his dealings. There were no secrets to be exploited or lies to be exposed. Late at night the leaders conspired against him. "There are no grounds for complaints against him," one yelled. "What if we made up a reason? What if we created a law that we knew he would break?" the other whispered. They thought carefully about how to trap Daniel. The only thing they could think to exploit was his faithfulness to God. It was dawn, and King Darius was enjoying his morning in the gardens of the palace. Darius was a better king than most, but he still lacked a knowledge and reverence for the Lord. Therefore he was vulnerable to self-worship and pride. His men knew this and approached him with a plan to use Darius against Daniel. The 2 of them met the king in the garden and bowed before him. "Our king, live forever. You are truly worthy of our praise and affection." Their words pleased Darius. "All of the high officials have been speaking of your greatness. We believe it should be admonished before all the people of Babylon. Let us create a holiday. For 30 days we are to worship no god except for you." The king was interested. "How would we enforce such a law?" he asked. "Simple," they replied. "If anyone is caught praying to or worshiping any god besides you, then they will be sent into the lion's den. We will order our guards to keep a close watch on the whole nation." This idea thrilled the king. So he made an official decree that for the next 30 days no other god shall be worshipped but him. A few days passed, and the same leaders came to Darius in his palace. They wore grim faces and feigned dread. "Our king, we have terrible news," they said, trying to hold back their smiles. "Daniel, the exile from Judah, continues to pray to his God 3 times a day." When the king heard these words, he was greatly troubled. Daniel was his most trusted servant and the wisest governor under his rule. He purposed in his heart to find a way to relieve Daniel of his punishment, but there were no loopholes in his decree. Plus, he could not look weak in front of the other satraps. Darius did not sleep that night. He grieved what he had to do to Daniel, and he deep down knew that it was his own pride that would kill his friend. The next day looked as though the sun never rose. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the king's heart ached with regret. Daniel, the leaders of Babylon, and the guards escorted Daniel to the lion's den. Daniel did not struggle, and he did not protest. He walked with them with his head held high. A rumbling could be heard from the lion's den. Their roars shook the earth below him. The color had left the king's face. He looked more worried than Daniel did. Before Daniel was sent in, the king embraced him and said, "May your God protect you." The 2 men looked at one another. Daniel could see the pain in Darius's eyes. He smiled and allowed himself to be thrown deep into the lion's den. The lions were deep within the den, and Daniel could see the light reflecting against their eyes. Then, as the stone of the den was rolled over the entrance, all went black. Daniel's eyes had not yet adjusted to the darkness. He bent his knees to gain better footing. He was prepared to fight, or to submit, or to pray. He did not know which would be called for first. The low growls of the lions echoed off the walls of the den. The sound rumbled the earth. He could feel their roars in his chest. Daniel began to see shapes against the walls around him. Finally, his eyes were adjusting to the light. The shadows moved around him. Daniel shifted to the left and then to the right. The lions were surrounding him. Daniel prayed to the Lord in his mind. He knew that any word could set the lions pouncing. He looked to his left and saw the largest of the lions crouching next to him. It was getting ready to pounce. As its hind legs bent back like a spring, a bright light broke through the darkness. It was blinding, and Daniel could hear the painful roars of the lions scraping back against the wall. Daniel fell to his knees, barely able to see what was happening. The darkness was cut in half with light like a sword through flesh, and Daniel saw each lion cowering in fear. The lions hissed and roared at the light, but were soon quieted as their jaws were forced shut. Then, in an instant, the light vanished. All returned to darkness, and Daniel sat in the middle of the den, praying to the Lord. It was still night, and the sun was a few hours from rising. King Darius paced his room, worrying over Daniel. He did not eat or sleep all night. Instead, he set his mind on the welfare of his friend. He waited for the light to break so he could roll away the stone of the den. As soon as the light touched the bottom of the horizon, Darius put on his clothes and rushed to the den. He and all the men raced together and pulled away the stone. All was silent. Darius approached the entrance to the den. He looked down and listened for any sound. He could hear nothing. He became worried and shouted, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God delivered you from the lions?" There was a long pause. Darius's heart was beating fast. Then a small voice echoed up to the entrance. "O King, live forever. Of course I am safe, for I was blameless. My Lord upheld me and shut the mouths of lions." Darius let out a sigh of relief and ordered his men to send a rope to bring him up from the den. Daniel was brought back into the light. The king embraced him and then looked back at the men who had accused Daniel. The king's rage burned against them. Immediately they were taken. The guards grabbed them and threw them into the lion's den. It took no time at all for the lions to pounce and tear the men limb from limb. Their cries burst through the whole of the den. The sound of ripping flesh and bloody screams filled the air for a moment. Then all was silent again. Darius praised Daniel and his God. He was another king that was humbled by the favor of God on a faithful servant.